Good morning. Thanks for coming to our panel on border security, myth versus reality. My name is John Davidson. I'm the political editor at The Federalist and a senior fellow at the Right on Immigration Project here at TPPF. I want to give very brief opening remarks and kind of set the stage for our discussion, and then I'll introduce our panelists, and then we'll get right into what I hope is a free-flowing kind of discussion, and try to leave time at the end for you all to ask questions, and hopefully we can cover a lot of ground. Now, whenever I do panels like this or talks like this, it's very difficult to gauge the level of background knowledge in the audience, and so in hopes that this will be as useful to you and as informative as possible, I'm just going to run down quickly what's been happening at the border over the past year or so, and then in our discussion we'll get into more deeper context of what's been happening at the border over the past several decades and what's different now and why things have changed. So quickly, last year we saw a sharp increase in illegal immigration along the southwest border. Record numbers of Central American families and unaccompanied minors arrived at the border, many of them claiming asylum. As a result of this, U.S. border facilities, which were not designed to accommodate families or children, were quickly overwhelmed. Large groups, some as large as 1,000 individuals at a time, were crossing the border and turning themselves into Border Patrol, which was something of a new phenomenon. We saw this begin to happen back in 2014 with the unaccompanied minor crisis, and that eased off, and we actually had record low numbers of illegal immigration in 2017 and 2018, and then last year those numbers surged back up again. And this reignited a long-standing debate in America about immigration reform and border security and so on. Of the people who arrived last year at the southwest border, the majority were families, and that marked a major shift from previous years. And another shift is that non-Mexicans accounted for about 80% of all apprehensions at the southwest border. For the first time on record, Mexicans did not account for the largest single country of origin in fiscal year 2019, which was Guatemala, followed by Honduras. In response to all this, in June, the Trump administration demanded, under the threat of import tariffs, that Mexico crack down on illegal immigration, specifically illegal immigration from Central America. The Mexican president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, responded by deploying the newly created Mexican National Guard to the northern and southern borders of Mexico, and sharply increased deportations and immigration enforcement throughout the country. The Trump administration also responded by establishing the Migrant Protection Protocols, or Remain in Mexico program, which requires migrants seeking asylum in the United States to wait in Mexico while their asylum cases are being adjudicated. It began as a small pilot program in El Paso, but has since expanded now to much of the border, and the administration has, since the start of the program, sent more than 60,000 migrants back across the border to Mexico to await the outcome of their asylum cases. In addition, the Trump administration brokered a kind of safe third country agreement with the government of Guatemala to send asylum seekers from Honduras and El Salvador who show up at the southwest border back to Guatemala to seek asylum there. The result of all of these efforts has been a steady drop-off since May of last year in illegal immigration at the southwest border. It remains to be seen if this strategy, which relies almost entirely on the cooperation and competence of the Mexican government, is sustainable or can be successful. And we are perhaps already seeing the limits of this approach. This week, a caravan of some 4,000 Central Americans clashed with Mexican security forces at the Mexico-Guatemala border. This is the largest such group in more than a year. So as we get closer to springtime and the seasonal surge in migration that spring usually brings, it remains an open question whether these policies will be enough to secure the border, or if we're about to see a repeat of the border crisis that we saw last spring. And with that, let me introduce our panelists. To my immediate right is David Agren. He's a freelance journalist who has covered Mexico since 2005, mostly reporting on Mexican political, public policy, and security issues, along with the Central American migration and the Catholic Church in Latin America. He reports regularly for The Guardian, USA Today, and Catholic News Service. His writing has also appeared in The Lancet, The Washington Post, and The Economist. To his right is Sandra Sanchez. She is the South Texas correspondent for Nexstar Media Group's BorderReport.com, a digital platform launched in July that covers border and immigration 24/7 for Nexstar's 107 television stations nationwide. She covered immigration in the 90s for USA Today, where she was a reporter and Southwest correspondent for 9 years. She's been an opinion editor for the Monitor newspaper in McAllen, assistant opinion editor for the Waco Tribune-Herald, and assistant national editor for the Austin American-Statesman. And to her right is the Honorable John Hostetler, Vice President of Federal Affairs for States Trust at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. He served in the U.S. House of Representatives from 1995 to 2007, representing Indiana's 8th District. He launched a publishing company, Publius House, and authored 2 books, and also founded the Constitution Institute, which holds seminars throughout Indiana teaching about the U.S. Constitution. He's an engineer by training, graduated from the Rose-Hulman Institute of Technology in Terre Haute, Indiana. Please give a quick welcome to our panelists, and then we'll get right into our discussion. So, I'm assuming this microphone is still on. You can all hear me. David, I want to begin with you because you recently took a trip to Central America, to Guatemala, I believe. Three trips.
Actually, 4 trips. 2 to Guatemala, 1 to Honduras, the other one to
El Salvador. And part of the purpose of the trips, these were fact-finding research trips to the sending communities in Central America. And I think the reason I want to start with you is based on this news that we just got this week of this large caravan from Central America clashing with Mexican security forces. We haven't seen caravans in a while, big ones like this. What can you tell us about the sending communities in these countries?
Yeah, sure. First, just thank you to the Texas Public Policy Foundation for the invitation. At the same time that this most recent caravan left, within 2 days later, the Honduran government ended a mission called MASI, which was an anti-graft mission backed by the Organization of American States. I don't think that's a coincidence. And what you have in let's just start with each country individually. Honduras, high levels of corruption. You have political problems in the country. The president's brother has been convicted in a U.S. court of drug trafficking. It's a not so open secret that narcotics trafficking gangs are funding pretty much all the political parties in Honduras. What you have in Honduras is just this confluence of factors, whether it's gang violence, poverty, rising cost of living, corruption in the health system so bad that money was embezzled out of it and sent into the governing National Party's campaign. A doctor that was leading protests there told me it's to the point that doctors coming out of operating theaters will take off their scrubs and give it to the next person going in. So it's just a generally unhappy place that has not improved, and so. You add all that up, it's just a factor of a lot of people just are unhappy and want to go. And then people also know that if you bring a child to the United States, you will be treated differently. That is just an open secret that coyotes have spread. It's believed.
Coyotes are the term for
the human smugglers. Yeah, and it's to the point that in Honduras, what was very surprising too is that a lot of the people that are leaving and coming in caravans are people that have jobs. They just can't make ends meet. They're tired of the corruption. They don't see a solution, and I think what happens with, in that country at least, because of the political problems, people have lost hope. That's the key thing. Guatemala is more rural. Or just quickly, El Salvador has major problems, obviously, with gangs, MS-13 and 18th Street. So those just one of the problems if you are threatened by a gang is that it's a very small country and it's very hard to flee the gangs. The gangs have a national presence. So if you move from one neighborhood to another, you're going to obviously come to the gangs have such control of their neighborhoods that if you move from an MS-13 neighborhood to a Barrio 18 neighborhood, you're going to come to their attention, and they're going to wonder why you're moving there. So, there's just this, you just cannot, it's very hard to move internally, so that prompts people to try migrating. Guatemala, the big outflow areas are Huehuetenango and San Marcos, sort of up by the Mexican border. These are very poor areas, which are often also very indigenous areas, and they've long been neglected by the Guatemalan state. There's just the state presence there is just minimal, and we're not. Never mind government programs, just basic things such as roads, infrastructure. There's just been such corruption and such neglect that these places are just living in abandonment, and it's gotten to the point too where you have. People have come to see their future in the United States. You go to these communities, you see people building houses. People leave with the idea that they're going to go to the United States, make some money, build a house back home, and return.
And so, our people are leaving their families in these communities, even if they're taking a child.
That's right.
With them.
They'll take one child there.
Right.
And I cited an example of a coffee. I was just going to say quickly on top of that, there are very serious issues of drought. So massive crop failure, which is forcing people to leave. We're hitting 5 years of drought now in Honduras. Coffee prices hit the floor, which that's a major cash crop there. So people are, finding it hard to make ends meet. But I remember meeting a farmer who was. I went with Catholic Relief Services up into the Western Highlands, or the Western Highlands of Honduras, and their model farmer who had done work to go organic, who had planted trees on his land, had planted avocados to diversify his crops, just left one day, and he went to the United States. Ended up in Houston, and he's working in a gravel pit. And his son basically said, he basically saw the U.S. as his way to get out of debt, and also hopefully get a little more money to expand his holdings, and then sort of just in passing mentioned that he went with a 17-year-old, one of his sons, a 17-year-old. And I said, well, why him? And he said, well, he thought the child should have a chance to migrate. And being a child, everyone believes that if you get to the U.S. border and just surrender to the Border Patrol, Customs CBP, you will be treated differently.
And I guess part of the reason that people keep doing this in these communities, some of which, from what I understand, have seen massive outflows, especially in northern Guatemala, is that it works. It like the proof is sort of in the fact that
people stay.
That money is that the people who send a family member to the United States are doing much better than the people who don't.
There's a material difference.
Yeah, right.
That's obvious. And so one thing you do, what's really interesting with Central America is just the economies there are. There's a Bloomberg article that was just brilliant on this. That the economies there are, the model of the economy is immigration.
Right.
The governments spend very little per capita on health, education, you name it. But then migrants leave, and then migrants send back these enormous remittances. That is disposable income. It keeps people, prevents uprisings in the countryside. It prevents people, or it keeps people fed and housed. Yeah. And then you will also see people having a lot of extra disposable income. Any of these cities in Guatemala, you will go there, you will see more American fast food franchises than you will see here in Austin.
Right. So that's a really brief sketch of some of these sending communities in Central America. Sandra, I want to ask you how has the arrival of these groups of people from Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala in family units, and the arrival of so many teenagers and minors changed the situation at the border and changed how the Border Patrol and CBP have been able to handle it, and changed maybe the calculus of the network of organizations that facilitate the movement of people from Central America through Mexico and across the U.S. border.
Well, again, thank you for allowing me to come.
Yeah.
One thing I'd like to say is that it doesn't work anymore for the Central American migrants. I can tell you that. I live in South Texas. Willingly went back in the summer. We had lived there for 5 years. Love covering the border and its issues. It's constantly evolving. The day that our digital platform launched on July 17th was the day that the Trump administration implemented Migrant Protection Protocols, MPP. And there is a refugee camp on the other side of the Gateway International Bridge that literally went from 200 mostly Mexicans who were there under the metering policy to 600 people in 2 days. There are now 2,500 people living at that. It's a filthy tent encampment on the banks of the Rio Grande. They're not getting across. They are all waiting there, and they're legally waiting there under MPP. They're not trying to cross illegally. They are staying in Mexico as they are told. That has been a game changer. The migrant shelters are now empty. They're not there. And so as a response, the volunteers, local communities are now crossing the bridge to offer services on the other side.
Shelters in the U.S.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
You're speaking of Matamoros?
In Matamoros. They're actually driving from McAllen to Brownsville and walking over the Gateway Bridge to Matamoros to these facilities, to the tent encampment, because the people aren't coming over anymore. But the people in Central America are not aware yet. It hasn't filtered to the small towns of the policy. I've been on Border Patrol ride-alongs, which I try to do as many of as possible, and they're not easy to set up. It takes me about 2 months to set up one Border Patrol ride-along. So, and I've met people who are just apprehended, and I've said, you know, do you know that you're going to go over the bridge to Matamoros? And they have no idea. They've never heard of this. As a result of this new policy, so we have two main policies in effect, the MPP, which are for the Central Americans, and then metering, which is for the Mexicans, which only allow so many Mexican nationals to cross over the POE, or the port of entry, any given day. Really, there's nobody on the U.S. side that's not catch and release anymore. It's been a total, complete change from when I lived here for 5 years prior, when the immigration surge began in 2014, where we had a lot of unaccompanied alien children, UACs they're called, a lot of children, a lot of families, detention of families. Now a person has to immediately prove that they have a very viable fear of persecution, reason for not being sent back to Mexico, or a physical or a mental handicap. Supposedly these are exemptions that are under the MPP policy. As a result, the Border Patrol is actually, it's boosted the morale of agents, because they said that they are now doing their job like they're supposed to do their job, which isn't passing out peanut butter and jelly sandwiches or changing diapers in detention facilities. They're patrolling the border. They have had, you know, the facilities went from being so overly crowded to now there's only about 300 apprehensions per day in the Rio Grande Valley, which is the busiest sector in the nation. This was
down from
about
1,000.
Yes, 1,500 to 2,000
Yeah.
a day. Mid-July, we had Chuck Schumer, and there were 17 representatives who came down, and senators came down, and that was the height of the crisis. And so this policy has changed that.
Right, and we should mention too the shelter in that you're talking about that's now 2,500 people. There are shelters now along the Mexican side of the northern border, all up and down the border. There are shelters in Mexico where MPP migrants are waiting. In Juarez, in Reynosa, in Matamoros, in Nuevo Laredo, and these are not safe places, right?
It's not a shelter.
Yeah, right.
It's not a shelter. Not in Am I still on?
Yeah.
It's not a shelter in Matamoros. It's just a spit of land that is owned by the federal government. The National Guard is right there in their camouflage, and the migrants felt safe to camp right there.
Yeah.
The Matamoros police have moved them further toward the interior of the city, but this is an area that is controlled by the drug cartels. This is an area where children are kidnapped overnight from the tents. This is an area where drug cartels come through overnight and force women and small boys into prostitution. This is an area where some parents have actually sent their children over the bridge to be UACs to declare themselves unaccompanied alien children so that they will cross and no longer have to live in their... Under MPP, if you read the DHS clause under MPP, it states that Mexico will provide humanitarian shelter and services for these people. I'm a journalist. I'm straight down the middle of the road. There is no shelter in Matamoros, so that is not being provided.
Is there any along the border? Maybe.
Well, there's one that I went to, a federally run shelter in Juarez, where the Mexican army was providing food, and it was staffed by federal employees. But there were only about 600 people there, and it was the only one. This was in August, and they told me, that we have plans for federal shelters all up and down the border. That hasn't materialized. I think the best way to describe what you're talking about is they're tent cities, essentially.
Right, they're individual tents.
They're individual. People are camping outside in an area designated by the Mexican government, but there's no services.
I was going to say,
No, there's no service.
and I think Matamoros actually might be one of the calmer cities compared to Reynosa and Nuevo Laredo.
And my network actually allows me to cross there, but I am not allowed to cross into Nuevo Laredo or Reynosa because it is very, very violent. I mean, I know the drug cartels know me when I walk over them. I'm marked. They know that I'm a journalist. I know not to get in a taxi cab because they kidnap you from taxi cabs. I walk over the bridge. And I stay safely within that area. These people have been offered, a couple months ago, the Matamoros government tried to round up the children because the temperatures got very cold. It was in the 30s. The wife of the mayor of Matamoros sent the equivalent of CPS in Mexico, in the city, with intentions of helping the children, that it was too cold for them. They were having frostbite. But the families did not want them to go because once you leave the confines of that federal land, you are in an area that is controlled by drug cartels, by very, very dangerous and bad people, and I will not travel there. And so they're fearful. They want to put them in a shelter, a stadium, but it's 6 miles in the interior, and they're afraid to go there. So they're just camping. They've overrun. There's no grass. There's coral snakes, venomous coral snakes. They bathe in the Rio Grande. There's no electricity. There's no water. They have built little tables and kitchens. They made ovens out of the mud from the banks of the Rio Grande. They're actually very industrious. They've chopped down trees and made tables where they serve each other food. They make rice, chicken soup. People bring chicken to sell. They make, they cook for themselves. But it's fascinating to see these ovens they have fashioned out of the mud.
Wow. John, if we could back up, if you could talk to us about, so MPP was designed to correct what the administration saw as a flaw in federal immigration law and in policy, under sort of the colloquial phrase catch and release, which the administration has repeatedly said their policies are meant to solve the problem of catch and release. Can you just take us back and quickly describe what catch and release is and why it was, what it consisted of, and how it is that the administration was able to promulgate something like MPP as a solution to catch and release?
Well, MPP, the Migrant Protection Protocol, otherwise known as Remain in Mexico, is specifically addresses asylum and asylum policy. And you have to realize that with regard to asylum, let's just take a non-controversial issue such as the wall or the barrier. Asylum, the claim for asylum essentially allows a person to, once they set foot on U.S. soil, to make a claim. And when that claim is made, then a lengthy process is put into place, and that process ultimately is likely to be adjudicated in an immigration court. So they come to the border, they cross the border, and as was mentioned earlier, they seek out a green uniform. Now,
and I'll just say, for those who haven't been to the border, I've heard this before. People say like, well, we just build a wall and then they can't come across. Well, it doesn't work that way. The wall is entirely on U.S. soil. Yes. So in places like downtown El Paso, where the Rio Grande is just a stream that you can wade over, all they need to do is walk to the south side of the wall that's on U.S. soil and wait for Border Patrol to come pick them up. And you can drive through downtown El Paso and see people, families walking along the south side of the wall who have just crossed into U.S. territory. So for people who are seeking asylum, building a wall is not a solution. It doesn't work.
It
So,
most
sorry,
certainly
go ahead.
doesn't.
Didn't mean to interrupt you.
No,
Just wanted to
you're
clarify
exactly
that.
right, and that's the point with regard to the wall. And so the Migrant Protection Protocol was put in place to deal with this massive increase of claims of asylum, because kind of going back to 2018, then Attorney General Sessions, ultimately acting Attorney General Whitaker, had put into place a particular provision dealing with the Northern Triangle countries who are experiencing massive amounts of violence, whether it's gang violence, domestic violence, very tragic stories, very tragic accounts on a massive scale. The Attorney General had put into place a change in a particular provision in considering claims for asylum, in that one of those allowed definitions for the claim of asylum is membership in a particular social group. A previous immigration court had determined that individuals who were subject to domestic violence, gang violence, or the threat thereof could claim a reasonable fear of persecution because of the violence. Well, that's not what the Convention on the Status of Refugees in 1951 and the later protocol was about. It was about political persecution, not necessarily these very unfortunate claims of personal violence, non-state sponsored. And so anyway, going back to MPP, MPP was an instrument by the administration to say, okay, we have to adjudicate these claims, but we're going to ask Mexico to hold the individuals who have come from Mexico, ultimately crossed the border, and this Migrant Protection Protocol is in cooperation with Mexico. And I think what John mentioned earlier has to be driven home to everyone, and that is the success that we're seeing. When I say the success, the massive drop in apprehensions across the southern border is the result of cooperation with by the Mexican government. If another administration comes in, another way of thinking comes in, this could all go away with regard to Migrant Protection Protocol. But that protocol was an effort to address the asylum claims that were driving the numbers up in that. And you can see, we visited the Rio Grande Valley sector on Tuesday, a delegation of us from the Texas Public Policy Foundation's Border Security Coalition, TPPF, and some outside organizations, and saw the numbers in fiscal year 2019. The RGV sector, Rio Grande Valley sector, was the highest in apprehensions, 349,000 apprehensions in one sector in fiscal year 2019. In the first 4 months of fiscal year 2020, which began in October of 2019, they have had 31,000 apprehensions. The number of apprehensions is less than a third of what it was prior to the Migrant Protection Protocol. And as was mentioned earlier by Sandra, now Border Patrol agents believe they can execute their primary function. Now, don't get me wrong, we went into the port of Hidalgo, the port of entry there, and as we were walking through and getting the report from the chief there, there were plenty of open bags of diapers on the shelf in the room that they were processing the individual. So CBP, well, I should say OFO, the port of entry folks and CBP are still providing that humanitarian service, and they are providing it actually more higher quality because of the drastic drop in the numbers of apprehensions.
Now, John, so I want to pick up on something you mentioned a few minutes ago. So to the extent MPP is working, and by working we mean that the number of people who are crossing and then being released is drastically dropped. To the extent it's working because the Mexican government has agreed to assist us with this policy initiative and to cooperate with federal agencies and to receive the migrants who are sent back across the Rio Grande. David, I want to ask you about this because this is, to my way of thinking, the Trump administration's entire approach to border security, given that the prospects for immigration reform in Congress are zero, as they have been for, 40 years. And there are different reasons for that, and we could get into that on a different panel. But it's not just MPP that we're relying on the Mexican government to implement. It's enforcement along the Mexico-Guatemala border. It's deportations and immigration checkpoints throughout the interior of Mexico. One of the things that Lopez Obrador did in June was deploy the newly created National Guard to the southern and northern borders. Shortly after he did that, I was in El Paso in New Mexico on a Border Patrol ride-along, which do take months to set up. Yeah, it takes me months. And we saw about every 100 yards a pair of Mexican National Guardsmen on the south side of the wall. They were, many of them had set up like sort of makeshift lean-to shades with a blue tarp, and they were just there. There was no vehicles. They were dropped off in the morning, and they get picked up 8 to 10 hours later. And I asked the Border Patrol agent that I was riding along with. I was like, "Can we go up to the fence and talk to them?" And he's like, "Yeah, if they'll talk to us." So we went up and we talked to a couple groups of these men and women. And they told us they had no authority to detain anyone, to arrest anyone, to do anything other than call it in when they saw something. And I said, "Well, what happens when you call it in?" And they said nothing. So they're essentially a show force. It would be like in a U.S. airport if the TSA just stood there and watched you walk through security, right? They have no legal authority. They're not empowered to detain. They have no resources. They have hardly any transportation, right? So a lot of them are new. So some of them are veterans of other branches of the military. Some of the ones we spoke to were brand new recruits, and this was their first assignment, first deployment. So what I want to hear your thoughts on it seems to me that our entire strategy to deal with this border crisis is to cooperate in partnership with the Mexican government, whose resources, as Sandra noted, are extremely limited, whose competence is in question, and I want to, you live in Mexico City, you cover the federal government a lot, and you're well connected there and well familiar with what's going on. How much confidence should we have in the AMLO administration to cooperate, and how much confidence can we have in the Mexican government's ability to continue this long term?
Well, that's several things. Well, I mean, one of the only thing the Mexican government really has said no to is signing a safe third country agreement, in which case that would mean if the migrant was coming through Mexico and then they get to the United States, they would be sent to Mexico to apply for asylum there. Mexico's asylum system is already saturated and it's very underfunded. So that's why there's MPP.
Safe third country is just what you said.
Yeah.
If you pass through a country on the way to the United States, you have to apply for asylum in that country and be rejected before you can apply for asylum in the United States.
Canada and the United States have an agreement like
Yep.
that. So someone comes into the someone goes from the United States to Canada, they go back to the United States, and vice versa.
Right.
Look, what the overall strategy, Mexicans say now that Mexico has become the wall, and effectively, the wall just keeps getting moved south, and this is why we've already had 200 plus people who've arrived in the United States to seek asylum sent to Guatemala to seek asylum there. The idea is just to keep people out of the border, out of the United States, out of the border region. Now, the Mexican government, if you look at its response to this caravan, they sent out their National Guard to the border.
This week.
Yeah, this week to the Suchiate River, which separates Mexico and Guatemala, part of the border. When they closed the border, they said anyone that wants to come into Mexico can apply for asylum. They can take part in a government make work program, which is there's a tree planting initiative that the president has started. Or they can be repatriated voluntarily, which is a polite way of saying deported. And so they basically, the migrants just said no, and there's just been a sort of a history of these caravans pushing through that they just all decided to ford the river. And the guards stopped them and detained them. And this is causing some debate in Mexico. But the Mexican government has been very insistent that these caravans will not cross. What it's doing is it's causing the migration to become a lot more clandestine. You don't see migrants walking along the road. You see them. I've spoken to migrants in these shelters in southern Mexico. The Catholic Church has a lot of migrant shelters throughout the country, and they're basically a purely humanitarian gesture. Place to sleep, eat, wash up, maybe see a doctor, and then maybe get some legal
sort
advice.
Of a way station.
Yeah, and then you're on your way.
Right.
And so people are arriving after walking very long distances. From my experiences in southern Mexico, there are checkpoints every 20 miles. They even check my ID. No, I don't think I look Mexican, but they always are very diligent. It feels like the Mexican government is doing its part. And I say that, and López Obrador, even though he speaks of being having a government from the left, I think he suffers no domestic political. There's no domestic political downside to his actions against migrants or against
I was going to ask
caravans.
you, what are the attitudes of Mexicans toward Central American migrants?
Well, increasingly negative.
Yeah.
I remember this when the caravans first arrived in October 2018. People were very hospitable. They came out. This is along the coast of Chiapas, very hot area. They would come out with water, food, clothes. People, these caravans were very well taken care of when they came through, because Mexicans there was such an outpouring of support. I revisited that area several months later, and people did not want to see another caravan again. And they felt that their generosity had been abused. When you're looking at, the attitude is that Mexicans don't want them to these caravans going through the country. When you get closer to the border, the issue up there is that their economy is trade. It's these factories, and there's so much cross-border movement all along the border that they are scared of having the border closed. Hence, they will cooperate with the United States.
So Trump's threat last year that he would close the border unless something was done about these caravans, and that he would impose, I think it was a 5% import tariff or something like that.
It was an escalating tariff.
That would escalate. Is the kind of threat to get the attention of.
Well, and this is what you see. This is the difference with the Trump administration. What had traditionally happened in the United States and Mexico is their teams would sit down and talk trade, or they would talk security, or they would talk whatever the topic. They never mixed them. With the Trump administration, everything is on the table, and I think this sounds a little odd, but the Mexican government, it's a very nationalist government. It sort of feels like what they've traditionally done is they have a long history of whatever administration is of conceding to the United States. Mm-hmm. And they will concede what they have to so that they can get that issue resolved. López Obrador is entirely domestic. He has been he's been in office for 13 months. He has not left the country yet. He's not especially worried about the wider world. Mexico has a traditional non-intervention foreign policy. They want to be left alone. And I think he's delegated this task with the United States to his foreign minister. The foreign minister is dealing with it. And López Obrador continues touring the country and doing his thing.
If I could jump.
Yeah,
Can you hear me?
absolutely.
Yeah.
Can you all hear me? Is my mic working?
There it is.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. If I could jump in and perhaps challenge a couple points. While I do see Mexico has greatly stepped up enforcement of the southern border, it has not of the northern border.
Yeah,
it is
I'll defer to you on
completely
this.
different. Yes, they did stop the caravan this week with tear gas, and yes, they did tell people turn around, go back, or they're stuck there. You're not coming. You're not crossing. But the northern border, they have really abrogated their responsibilities. According to MPP, they're supposed to provide so much for these people. They're not. It's being provided by humanitarian volunteers from the U.S. side that have done that. Also, with regards to the USMCA agreement, I know Congressman Vicente Gonzalez came out very strongly about the fact that border security was not addressed as far as the agreement. We have drug cartels in control of the northern border, rampant crime and corruption, and they are in control of that border. I don't know why López Obrador has never even visited the Matamoros refugee camp. He went to El Paso a week and a half ago. Yep. But kind of out of sight, out of mind, not acknowledging it. So I would not say that Mexico has fulfilled its obligation. And with USMCA, the fact that it did not address the security concerns, which greatly limit the ability of these maquiladoras of the trade, and which is so important, so vital to the border economies. Laredo has the number one port of entry for products coming through the country. Something 60% of everything comes through the Laredo POE. So it's a huge concern, and so I think there's some misinformation. Mexico's a big country. They've got it under control on the southern border, I think, but not on the northern.
But one thing, just speaking the political considerations, López Obrador is now he won overwhelmingly in the last election. 53% of the vote. He won plurality in every state except for one. He wants to win the borderlands. He knows that he doesn't win the borderlands if there's a migration issue. So he wants, I see sort of some political incentives for him to play ball with the United States. Certainly Mexico has not fulfilled its obligations with the MPP. What to say? I mean, it's interesting because López Obrador is very critical of non-governmental groups. They call Sociedad Civil there in Mexico, and it's the Catholic Church and various charities and good-hearted people that look after migrants. It's not the Mexican government, and López Obrador, it should be said, he's also someone who's a very austere figure, and his government. For being a left-wing government, it doesn't believe in taxing and it doesn't believe in spending. And they're certainly not going to spend money on migrants. But the one thing he will do is he will cooperate with the Trump administration. And I'm trying to remember the last time I've seen President Trump tweet, complimentary things about Mexico. There was the acting Homeland Security Secretary was very complimentary of Mexico this week. This talk of designating cartels as drug cartels as terror organizations, Mexico didn't want it, and President Trump has more or less said out of respect for Mexico he wouldn't do it. So I think my sense, and just from the people I've spoken with, is that it feels like the Trump administration sees someone in Mexico that they can play ball with, and they will give a little if they have to.
Yeah, and so this brings up another facet to this, which doesn't directly bear on migration, but it is related because it's the border, and at the border, as we said earlier, things that used to be kept separate are now being thrown together. So trade and immigration and commerce are connected. So we have had over the past year several incidents that you may have heard about in the news of major security problems in Mexico with drug cartels, and this brings up sort of an area for López Obrador that he's been reluctant to cooperate with the United States, and he's been reluctant to come forward with any kind of a security strategy that is anything more than campaign slogans. So we had, I believe it was in October, the Battle of Culiacan, where a contingent of Mexican National Guardsmen serving a U.S. warrant against one of the sons of El Chapo, the now imprisoned former leader of the Sinaloa cartel, attempted to arrest this guy and were attacked by rapid tactical response teams of the Sinaloa cartel that basically besieged the city, shut down any way out for this contingent of National Guardsmen, and then sent squads out to kidnap the families of the Mexican National Guardsmen that were involved in this operation. Within a matter of hours, this happened. There were burning vehicles in the streets. There were dead bodies strewn on the ground. And in the end, the Mexican government ordered the National Guardsmen to stand down and release the prisoner. And it was this massive, very public defeat of Mexican security forces by cartel security forces, essentially, which brings up the question, who is exercising sovereignty in Culiacan? Like, who is actually in charge in this area? And then it was weeks later that we had the massacre of the LeBaron family about 70 miles from the Arizona border. In Sonoma, is that where that is? Sonora. Yeah, I'm sorry. Sonoma's in California.
And recently, Nuevo Laredo. Recently, we had a shootout in Nuevo Laredo between forces. That was
between cartel forces and security forces.
And there's the disturbing stories too that the Tamaulipas State Police were not being supported by the National Guard.
Right.
So.
And what I heard was you had migrants who were on the bridge waiting for their judicial court hearings, and there was just bullets flying. I did speak to people who live in Laredo who actually were in their basements because they well, if you were on social media that day, you would have seen all the posts where it was rapid gunfire. Nobody on the U.S. side was struck or hurt. But you heard it. It was like fireworks, and it wasn't fireworks. It was automatic weapons, and they were firing.
And so this is somewhat new in terms of the degree to which these groups are seemingly operating with impunity in Mexico, in northern Mexico, seemingly in control of vast swaths of territory where they are the de facto authority. And I've been told many times as well that migrants don't cross the border. Once they get up to the border, they don't cross until they pay the tax to whatever drug cartel controls that area.
They have to give a code word.
Right. And it's an extra. It's a fee that's usually rolled into the smuggler's fee.
It's told $1,000.
Yeah, $800 to $1,000, which can change, and which sometimes the migrants don't have, and so they are in debt to these cartels after they enter the United States, which. They're not. Their ordeal's not over because the cartel knows about their family and everything else. So, in the few minutes we have left in our time, John, if you could speak to this, how much confidence can we have in Mexico as a partner in MPP and in getting a handle on the border when it seems that the Mexican government is not entirely in control of its northern borders and these communities that are dealing with migration?
Well, and that's the $64,000 question, in that we're making agreements with a state actor when in fact that state actor is not in charge of the state, and ultimately Mexico has to get involved with the security of their own country. I don't know the Spanish, I apologize, but my understanding is that the president has a slogan that he's used to the point of political victory, something about not...
Abrazos, no balazos, hugs, not bullets.
Hugs, not bullets. So the idea is that in Mexico, the cartels are going to be loved out of existence. And that type of mentality, that type of approach is what we're working with. So this could be a very transient situation that we're dealing with, that when the Mexican government realizes they cannot control things in the north, then completely, and there's no facade of control, then the cartels are going to have even more operational control, or complete operational control of the border, which is why border security, in everything that Border Patrol is asking for, personnel, more people in uniforms, technology, advanced technology that they can leverage with the personnel, and then infrastructure. And none of these things are the answer. And infrastructure, we're talking about mainly a barrier, the wall, for example. They need these three types. And with that securing of the U.S. border, then the United States will have less to contend with. But also the idea that these hundreds of thousands of people can come through Mexico, come from Mexico, if things get bad enough in Mexico. Because what we're not talking about at this point, hasn't gotten bad enough, is to think about the violence that's being perpetrated in the Northern Triangle countries, magnify that proportionally in the U.S., and you're talking about a much closer caravan experience coming across the border, and something has to be there. Yeah, Mexican nationals
who cross the border and claim asylum.
And is that true that Mexicans are waiting at the border now?
Yeah, under metering, they're waiting. And if I could just, to expand upon what you said, it is Border Patrol calls it a border infrastructure system, BIS, and that includes floodlights. It's a 30-foot metal bollard wall with 6-inch slats with 4-inch gaps in between. 6 feet of concrete. It has a 5-foot anti-climb metal plate at the top. They are all rusted because they're just kind of laying out in the sun, so they all go up looking red and rusted. And that criticism is that you can still climb it, you can still throw a ladder up there, but you have to jump the last 5 feet over it. They're being built over a levee border system in Hidalgo County, which is anywhere from 1/2 mile to 2.5 miles set back from the actual border, to address something that you said earlier. In Starr County, there is no levee system that is to the west of Hidalgo County, where I'm based. But they're starting to build this. I had exclusive footage of it at the Arroyo Ramirez, which is in Starr County. And there's already a mile of wall up there, and they're planning for 3 miles. But they have to obtain property from mostly private landowners in South Texas. And so they're starting in federal land areas. And so they're not going to connect the dots, connect the wall for quite some time. There are still 80 eminent domain cases that are pending in court from 10 years ago, from the 2006 Secure Fence Act, when they built the first wall, right?
Yeah.
So,
So there's a complicated matrix of issues that overlap here. So property rights then come into it. I should mention too, Starr County, very sparsely populated area, and also a thoroughfare for there's a lot of drugs that move through Starr County.
Yes, leading area for apprehension of marijuana and seizure of narcotics in the nation.
And just quickly on the president, with the president, his campy slogan, a campaign slogan, he has spoken in the last week. He has spoken more about the presidential aircraft, which he refuses to use. It's this 787 Dreamliner that was bought in 2012. It's been a trope that he has railed against as for excess government, unnecessary luxuries, He likes saying you can't have a poor people with a rich government. And when it comes to communication, I should say he's very similar to President Trump in that way. He's very good at labeling people, using social media, having slogans, etc. He's very, very effective. But with this, he has spoken more about that this week than pretty much anything else, regardless of. And there have been cases of violence. 10 musicians from the state of Oaxaca who were murdered and bodies burned in their vehicle in Guerrero State, which is the heroin-producing heartland. It's just he. I remember going to Ciudad Victoria in the capital of Tamaulipas State, where he, in 2016, where in one of his perpetual rallies, he spoke more about the presidential aircraft than he did security. I mean, it's hard to describe with him, but he believes that the root causes are poverty and violence. Social sciences don't really see a lot of proof for that, but in the meantime, he's going to, what's the right word? He's got a long-term strategy for a very acute problem.
Right. So with that, we're supposed to go to Q&A now. I don't know if there's a microphone somewhere in the room, but wait for the microphone, and then be sure to phrase your question as a question, if you know what I mean. But let's start up here in the front with this gentleman here.
Thank you. My name's Dr. Dwayne Collins. I work with a group called the Texas Border Volunteers. We work south of Alpheus, north of McAllen, at one of the busiest checkpoints. We station ourselves in the bush with our night vision. I'm going to talk to you afterwards. I can't go to all details. 40 years ago, I made the observation that if a country wants to destabilize the United States, all they have to do is go south of our border and cause an insurrection. They'll come across that border in numbers we cannot stop. How are foreign countries involved in what's going on down there? I don't think you're going to stop what's going on down there unless you get somebody in there to take the cartels out like we did ISIS. And we as a country have neglected our Western Hemisphere. We have put money in other foreign countries, but we have neglected the hemisphere. That's 3 questions. Please answer.
So the question is, what do we do about that?
What do we do about it? Are there foreign countries down there involved in what's going on? And what is our country doing to invest in those Western Hemisphere countries?
To your third point, that's a fair point. I would describe our policy toward Mexico and Central America as one of benign neglect that's gone on. Yeah, that's persisted for decades. We've had initiatives like Merida for Mexico and its Central American version of that as well. They've kind of been slow walked. The model kind of after Plan Colombia, but the funding for that has sort of steadily decreased since it was first passed in 2008, I think. But to the point about the cartels, and I'd be interested to hear you guys' thoughts on this. There is a sense in which the cartels are actually a buffer for other kinds of violence, for let's say terrorism. The cartels are in the money-making business. Yeah. They need to move products across the border, and they need to move cash back into Mexico.
They're very resourceful. In fact, what they're doing now is they're kidnapping the migrants from the refugee camps. They're forcing them to cross the border in other areas like Arizona, carrying narcotics with them. And then those people are getting arrested and they're saying, I was forced to do this. So they've not only profited the first time from the person paying the coyote to take them across, but now they're carrying their goods for them a second time. They found a way to benefit off of the new policy that's in effect.
And they're making, in some parts of the border, they're making significant amounts of money in migrant trafficking, essentially, in smuggling.
The CBP at Border Patrol agents at the Rio Grande sector said that the income from human smuggling rivals that of drug smuggling, almost $24 million a week. So they are making massive amounts of revenue from human trafficking, and it's almost eclipsing the drug.
One of the difficulties of the cartel situation in Mexico is that it's gone from organized crime to, some people say, disorganized crime. Reynosa, for example, who's in charge there?
They're very splintered. They're fighting amongst themselves.
You know,
they're having a war amongst themselves
it was what, Cartel del Golfo, and then it became Cartel del Golfo and Los Zetas. Cartel del Golfo has various factions. The Zetas have split.
Yes.
Every time they take out a kingpin, there's always a power struggle underneath. It just seems like violence surges as a result of that. So, coming in and taking out the big leaders hasn't really helped. It's a difficult one to, I have to admit, not a lot of people in Mexico are struggling for the answer, but at the same time, it sort of feels like the government just hasn't picked a strategy and stuck to a strategy. They keep reinventing the wheel. Every time there's a new president, they have to bring in a revamped security force, whether it's the National Guard or the Gendarmerie or federal
we should
police.
Say too, just last month, Garcia Luna, who was the equivalent of the Secretary of Homeland Security in the United States, all through the Calderon administration, was arrested in Dallas for being in the pay of the Sinaloa cartel. So it was his job during the Calderon administration to fight the cartels. That was his job. He was the top law enforcement official in the Mexican government, and he was being paid off by the Sinaloa cartel. So the level of corruption is sometimes hard for us to grasp here. Yeah. I know there's a lot of other questions.
It is so deep and so entrenched. Tierra Caliente in the state of Michoacan, after 50 years, I had someone say, how do you find a person that just hasn't had some contact with the industry, with organized crime?
I feel bad. There's a lady, she's had her hand up right there.
Yes, ma'am.
Right there, ma'am. You.
Thank you. My name is Marion Knowlton, and I come from that part of Texas. My question is following up on doctors. Is the president made a comment some time ago about having an intention of declaring the cartels foreign terrorist organizations. Then he backed off on that. Would you comment on the future of that taking place, or what your perspective is on that, please?
It's hard to know. The people I've spoken with, and this includes DEA, have said it's not really going to make a big difference in part. And part of it is, if I understand the act correctly, is that you're prohibiting doing business with terror organizations. Well, it's already illegal to buy drugs from the Sinaloa cartel. So I think we're sort of struggling to yes, these cartels use terror tactics, but are they terror organizations? I think that's a different question. And I think, as John said, they are profit-driven. And one of the ways you make money in their line of work is that you control territory, and you have the police force on your side to sort of give you free passage. So they are involved in politics, but only to serve their business interests.
Terrorists have a political motivation for their operations. These folks have an economic motivation, and while that economic is spilling over into political ramifications for Mexico, it would set a precedent that similar organizations around the world, and you would have so many terror organizations as a result of it. So the political ends that they're achieving is peripheral to their primary motivation.
Yeah, that's right. And we saw in the last round of elections in Mexico a very large number of political candidates assassinated, some in broad daylight, and a lot of these were local politicians, mayoral candidates, or local legislative representatives who were targeted by the cartels, who had a strong, powerful economic interest in controlling sort of the political machinery of that particular area where they are moving narcotics through. Let's go in the back to the gentleman there, and then we'll go to this side, and then we'll go to that side, if we have time.
I know this has been discussed before. What about bringing our U.S. military in, going across the border, and it's funded by the drugs, the money from the drug cartels, and we just take it and protect our lands?
The U.S. Army is patrolling. There's a sector from Georgia that is actually patrolling in Hidalgo County right now. There's 300 units that on our side, of course, not crossing over. There have been implementation of Army personnel along with the National Guard at the wall.
Yeah, and of course there's a tradition in the United States, a historical precedent for making incursions into Mexican territory, both with the Mexican-American War and the Pershing expedition in 1916, 1917. I think part of the delicate balance that we've touched on here is that the Trump administration, to get a handle on migration, has partnered with the AMLO administration, and to the extent the Mexican government doesn't want a military incursion into their sovereign territory, it's unlikely that the Trump or any U.S. administration is going to go against that, as if they're getting much of what they want in terms of cooperation on the migration issue. The question of the cartels, of course, can't be engaged without an acknowledgement that what's fueling the cartels is a massive appetite for consuming illegal narcotics in the United States, and a massive market for it that avails the cartels of an almost unlimited supply of resources to undertake these operations.
And Sandra said, they're very industrious. They're very, just when the heroin, the opioid crisis came along, they responded very nimbly. They may appear to be simple folk from the mountains, but they can be really sophisticated.
And the resources they have at their disposal rival, if not exceed, the limited resources at the disposal of Border Patrol and CBP in terms of technology. You go on border ride-alongs, and the Border Patrol agents will be like, they're watching us right now, they have drones, they have spotters all up and down the border, and they'll point them out. Those people are watching us. Those people are watching us right now.
And some of the stuff that we use, for instance, we have airboats, which you can hear for half a mile to a mile away,
right.
And all they do is just wait because it's very, very loud. I'll be on the border and I'll see little fires pop up. They'll light fires to signal to one another. They take children, 7-year-old boys are the ones that are required to carry the rope across the river, and they hook it on a tree. Then the people follow, holding on to the rope to get across. They sacrifice the boys if they hear a boat come or something. The boys are, they're responsible to grab that rope and get back. I mean, they have an entire network, an entire system. Yeah. They have it down pat.
Highly sophisticated. We got a question over on this side, gentleman, right here.
Yes, in terms of myth versus reality, when this whole terrorism thing started to get some traction, there was some articles published that said as much as 80% in any one given month of the people coming in were non-Mexicans. And in fact, this was no longer an immigration issue, it was an infiltration issue. And we had people coming in from Middle East, Africa, and even some from Russia through the border for reasons other than immigration. And we've all we've talked about this morning is Mexico. What?
Okay, well, I mentioned that in my opening that 80% are non-Mexican. The majority are Guatemalan, Honduras, and El Salvador.
The
so
Northern Triangle.
The Northern Triangle countries.
But there's also a lot of Africans that are coming through now, and they're enduring like a 16, 18-month journey. They're actually coming through the Del Rio Big Bend area. There's a tremendous amount of African migrants coming through there. And they're relocating to, of all places, Bangor, Maine.
And I'll say too, the irony is that a lot of the Africans who transit through South and Central America through Mexico have legitimate asylum claims. They are political refugees. They come from
There's a lot of Cubans too. For that very
they
reason.
come from authoritarian regimes. They actually fit the traditional definition of an asylum seeker. Unlike, I would think, a lot of the folks from Central America are facing economic hardships, they're facing domestic violence, they're facing gang violence, but they're not necessarily victims of government persecution.
So last week, I actually was one of the first journalists to get into the judicial tent court proceeding in Brownsville at the Gateway Bridge. And I sat through a docket. The judge heard 24 cases, 8 in the morning. The majority were Cubans. There were some Venezuelans. A woman said, I'm living and hiding in the basement of someone's house in Matamoros. I don't have a visa to work in Mexico. I'm fearful for my life. We were political opposition leaders in our island nation. And the judge said, in due time, this is your first NTA, your first notice to appear. You're going to fill out this paperwork and you're going to come back in 4 months or 5 months whenever they set the next docket. And then, you present all your information. And he said, and if you are saying to me that you're coming because of economic hardship, because you want a better life for your family, because there was crime in your country, don't even bother, because that's not one of the parameters, as you aptly noted, under the law. He did actually allow this Cuban couple, the woman, to be escorted to go talk to DHS on the spot about what's called a credible fear, and they were ushered out. In those hearings, they were ushered out without shoelaces. They were shuffled out. They take their shoelaces when they come because they're afraid they're going to use them as weapons. It was an amazing, stark realization in this tent city. No talking, raise your hand if you need to, use the restroom or you have a question. Journalist was the back half of the room. Row 3, there was nobody in the back half of the room, but I was assigned to row 3, so I sat in row 3. And it's by video conference. And then they go back over the bridge to wait. So they're holding these court hearings, asylum adjudication proceedings in these tents. There were at least 24 tents that were being operated that day. The judge in this case was in Port Isabel, about 25 miles away. Some judges are in Chicago, El Paso, Harlingen, Texas.
And that's that situation. We also have tent courts in Laredo.
In Laredo, it's fashioned the same way, the Laredo tent court.
Right, so it's all, there's a lot more that we could talk about and get into. There's so many facets of this. We are out of time, so please join me in thanking our great panelists today, and thanks for coming.